My name is Alex Padilla. I'm an associate professor of economics. I'm also the director of the Exploring Economic Freedom project. Give me a few seconds to talk about that project. So it's a project which is housed in the economics department at Metropolitan State University of Denver. It's an academic project that started in 2007. Its mission is to enhance the educational experience of our students by providing an academic forum for open scholarly discussions in the form of lectures, debates, and panel discussions, and reading colloquia on issues students and the broader community cares about. The project seeks to educate and to inform all students on issues related to economic freedom, political freedom, and civil liberties. The project engages in understanding the reasons for economic growth, economic development, entrepreneurship, and a more peaceful and prosperous society. This project is generously funded by a generous grant by Charles Koch Charitable Foundation. Today, we are very fortunate to have two eminent scholars, who are Robert A. Lawson and Benjamin Powell. We provided a few words about their biographies. I'm going to skip that. But Ben Powell, this is his fifth visit at Metropolitan State University. He actually started being our first guest, where he debated former Governor Richard Lamb on immigration in 2007. He's come to talk at Metro State a few more times, talking about sweatshops and again about immigration. He's the author of several and editor of several books. He has published numerous publications in top economic journals on a wide range of topics. And Bob Lawson is a professor, is a Jerome Foley Winder Centennial Chair in Economic Freedom and the director of the O'Neill Center for Global Markets and Freedom at Southern Methodist University. He has published a lot. He's one of the main authors of the widely cited Economic Freedom of the World Annual Reports. And Bob has been cited over 8,000 times according to Google Scholar. Today, our speakers are going to talk about their forthcoming book, which comes in July. It's called, pardon my French, Socialism Sucks. Two economists drink their way through the unfree world. They will discuss the main reason why I invited both guest speakers and to talk about this book is because in recent years, an increasing number of politicians, intellectuals, and even some economists have argued that socialism or democratic socialism would be a preferable economic system than the one we have right now. We can certainly disagree about what socialism is, but it remains that a lot of people are still supporting a system that has a poor historical record. Our guests were very fortunate or unfortunate to have traveled the world many times, and they visited so many of the countries we call socialist and democratic socialists. So I invited them to talk about their trips and their visit to show us what socialism or democratic socialism really looks like in the real world, compared to the theory and promises that political leaders, intellectuals, and some economists are trying to sell to us. Please join me in welcoming Bob Lawson and Ben Powell.
Thank you very much, Alex. It's a pleasure to be back here at Metro. I like Alex a lot. That's one reason I keep coming back here. But the real reason, which might not surprise you given the title of this book, is that you guys got lots of good beer in Denver. So Falling Rock Tap House is on the agenda for afterwards. So Alex kind of pointed to the reason that we decided to undertake this book. Actually, there's two reasons. There's the official reason and the unofficial reason. The unofficial reason is Bob wanted to get drunk in Cuba. And I said my wife wasn't going to just let me go on vacation with him. We needed a research reason. I got an idea for a book. And then 2 years later, we had a manuscript. The official reason is the resurgence of the interest in socialism in the United States, particularly among young people. So here's a tweet from that eminent scholar, Michael Moore, pointing out that most polls show now that young adults across America prefer socialism, parentheses, fairness, to capitalism, selfishness. Now, part of the problem is that there's a lot of confusion about what this word socialism means. It does not mean fairness, and capitalism does not mean selfishness. What these systems are have specific meanings and have real-world consequences, and we need a better understanding of them. So it's not confined to just Michael Moore spouting off crazy stuff. He's done that for years. But if you look at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, they did a survey among young adults and asked them their preferred economic system. 44% said socialism was their preferred economic system. 42% said capitalism. Another 7% said communism. There's chapters of Young Democratic Socialist of America springing up on college campuses across the country. One of the leaders of that, she just said, I think people in my generation, people who grew up post-Cold War, I don't think that socialism is as much of a scarlet S as it is for older folks. The taboo is never there for me. And that clearly seems true among today's college students and people in their 20s and early 30s. But it's not confined just to young people. A recent poll showed the majority of people, or a large number of people in the Democratic Party of any age group, favored socialism as an economic system. And the New York Times, over the course of a year, ran the Red Century column for the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution. That was a column a week all year long dedicated to socialism. Exactly one of those columns was dedicated to the economic stagnation of the Soviet Union and how a socialist economic system undermines society's productivity. Only a few of them, a handful, mentioned the mass atrocities of murders that were committed by socialist regimes. Instead, we got columns like Lenin's Eco-Warriors, how they were good for the environment, or my personal favorite, why women had better sex under socialism. Apparently, few scores of millions of dead bodies, or a little bit better sex is on the same playing field, which, by the way, I don't buy this better sex part either, if you actually read about what it was like for Russian women under socialism. Bernie Sanders today just announced that he's going to once again be a candidate for president of the United States. When he says he prefers socialism, and then asks for examples of it, he says it's countries like Denmark, like Sweden, and like Norway. This is causing further confusion among people of what socialism really is. And then, of course, the newest darling of socialism, AOC. I was going to put up an actual crazy quote from her, but you can just leave it in as the insert crazy quote here because she's full of them. So, by the way, this is Bob and I's first time since writing the book doing this talk together, so bear with us as we figure out how to go back and forth on this. But why don't you tell them a little bit about what socialism is not?
Yeah, so we're going to be doing a tag team here. This is weird. Never done this before. So the outline of the book is more or less the outline of our travels over the 2-year period from mid-2016 to 2018. And we went to Sweden, Venezuela, Cuba, Korea, China, Russia, Ukraine, and Georgia, and then back to the United States. And you can see each chapter has a sort of title, an adjective, socialism, so fake socialism, dark socialism, and so forth. And so that's how we organized the book. And let's get clear about what socialism is and what it isn't. And the first chapter is called "Not Socialism," and Sweden is the example. This is a picture of Ben and I drinking some beers in front of Duval Cafe. Duval Cafe is owned by a private individual. We never met that person, but we know it's not a state-owned enterprise. And in front of us, there's a street, and the cars driving by are privately owned cars, and people are going from their privately owned homes to their privately owned businesses, buying and selling products at unregulated prices. This is a market economy in every sense of the word. There is no sense of the word that Sweden is socialist. Socialism implies that the means of production, the resources, the land, the labor, and the capital are owned and controlled by a centralized authority. It requires a central plan. Sweden doesn't have a central plan. Sweden, in fact, in the Economic Freedom of the World Index that I work on, Sweden is 27th out of 162 countries. So to be sure, there are some freer countries, there are some more capitalist countries than Sweden, but most countries are less capitalist than Sweden. Sweden is 27th out of 162. It does have high taxes. In fact, I remember us complaining about the high beer prices in Stockholm because the taxes on beer are really high there.
We're going to have cheaper Belgian beer at Falling Rock later than you can get Belgian beer right nearby in Sweden because of the damn taxes.
So we wanted to get that out of the way. I mean, I sometimes joke in my other work when I'm doing development economics that if the whole world could turn into Sweden overnight, if I could make Congo and Bolivia and Bangladesh, if they could just all become Sweden tonight, even with the high taxes, I would take that deal. Sweden's a wonderful country, but it's mostly a free market country compared to most of the countries in the world, at least. Which brings us to, real socialism. Venezuela was one of our, I think, for me, the most memorable stop. Cuba and Venezuela were the two most memorable stops. This bridge here is on the border of Colombia and Venezuela. It's in Cucuta, the city in Colombia. You may have seen this in the news because this is the bridge where, on a daily basis, thousands of Venezuelans cross to buy on the other side, on the Colombian side, to buy basic necessities, rice, beans, sugar, deodorant, aspirin, whatever. We talked to a couple who had come 3 days. They'd traveled 3 days one way, so a 6-day round trip to essentially go to the grocery store. And they were middle class people. This wasn't poverty that we were talking about. This was I think he worked in a hotel, so these were middle class, established people who were really going to desperate lengths just to buy things that we would just go down to the 7-Eleven to buy. We changed some money there. Ben's holding about, I think that's about $5 or $6 in U.S. terms. So about this much money is about that much money is about $20. So $100 would be about a stack of money this high. If you wanted to buy a car, maybe $1,000 car, you need 5 stacks about this much high. So this is how much money you're talking about having to carry around. When you look, these people here are coming into or out of the country. When they came in, their bags were full because they had cash in the bags, and then they bring them back with the stuff that they were buying. How about we go to you, Ben? I think you're...
Yeah, don't even flip it. Notice notice the bags that they're carrying, too. The point that Bob made about this being... We've seen plenty of poverty in third world countries before when we've traveled. But what you're seeing here isn't the Venezuelans in extreme poverty crossing the border. These are people with access to money. These are middle class. Look at the luggage that's being pulled in the second picture there in the middle. That's the type of luggage that you'd expect to see at Denver Airport. These are people who were previously middle class, upper middle class, who are resorting to a 6-day grocery run across the border to get anything. They're the ones who are doing relatively better compared to the people in real poverty in Venezuela. For them, the situation is much more dire. So what happened here? We start with Venezuela because this was a good case for socialism. This was the one that just as recently as 2013, socialists in the United States pointed to as successful socialism. And in fact, go back to 1970, before they're socialist, they were a very free market economy back at that time, at least relative to the rest of the world, and they have a high standard of living. The average Venezuelan in 1970 was richer than the average person in Spain in 1970. Now, since then, they went to a lousier version of crony capitalism and stagnated and basically got little to no growth from the early 1970s to the late 1990s. But in 1998, Hugo Chavez comes to power. He's democratically elected. This is democratic socialism. International observers were there to see the elections. In fact, the former U.S. President, Jimmy Carter, was one of the observers. Everybody said it was a fair election that happened then. Then subsequently, he passed a new constitution, which again, people said was a fair election. I think that's 1999. And Venezuela began its experiment with socialism. And people, so this is the first quote here, is Bernie Sanders saying, "These days, the American dream is more apt to be realized in South America, in places such as Ecuador, Venezuela." This is before the recent downturn. Salon, when Hugo Chavez died in 2013, they ran a column and it was called Hugo Chavez's Economic Miracle. And in it, they said any U.S. president would love to have the economic legacy of socialism under Chavez. Well, what was going on? During these years, it wasn't that socialism was working. Venezuela sits on the world's largest oil reserves. Oil prices were way up. The Venezuelan government's socialist economic system wasn't providing. Instead, what they were doing was selling oil, using the foreign exchange to buy things and provide goodies to people who lived there. Eventually, what happened is, one, oil production started going down because of mismanagement of government ownership means of production. The government-owned oil company started going down. And then, eventually, when prices fell, all of this collapsed. Now, in the meantime, things like food imports per capita, those were going up all the time under Chavez. It's because food production was going down in Venezuela. The oil was masking this fact from people. So, notice some people now will say, well, it's not socialism that's failed Venezuela. It's the collapse in oil prices. Bob and I are both from Texas. Bob, have you seen Midland and Odessa in the Permian Basin collapsing?
No, and I think Iran's doing okay, too. I mean, most of the oil countries are doing just fine.
Yeah, it seems unique to Venezuela that this happened. It's because they had a broken economic system underneath. One of my colleagues, Kevin Greer, did a paper on this, studying the counterfactual under Venezuela and saying, given how oil prices went up, let's look at similar countries and what happened to their rates of poverty, income, and health. And what he and his co-authors find in that is Venezuela, it might have gone up under Chavez on some of those metrics, but it went up less than what you would expect it to based on the oil prices. So even while the oil prices were masking the chaos that was going on, they weren't getting the full benefit they should have out of it. Eventually this collapses, and once the government doesn't have revenue from oil production, or the same way, and it's got a collapsed economy that it can't raise much taxes off of, they resort to the inflation, why Bob tells you $1,000 or $100 is about this high. Look at this inflation rate, 80,000% estimated in 2018, which, by the way, it's a mess to estimate inflation there since you have price controls and things. But 80,000% at first doesn't seem conceivable. But this means 219% per day, doubling of prices, more than doubling of prices every day. Or in the course of an hour that you sit here with Bob and I, prices would have gone up about 9%. This is massive inflation wrecking their economy. So that $100, that's when we were there a year and a half ago. That stack's way bigger now. So what's happened to the people who aren't lucky enough to cross the border and get some supplies? So average loss of weight, 24 pounds in 2017. They didn't all of a sudden find Jetty Craig. This is them not being able to get enough food to maintain their body weight. Now, despite the Venezuelan constitution that Chavez passed, Article 83 says health is a fundamental social right and the responsibility of the state. Funny thing is, saying something's a right doesn't make it magically appear. You need an economic system that could deliver that. Remember that when people start talking about health care for all as a right of democratic socialists in the United States. It's a right in Venezuela, but they're losing weight and malnourished. And in fact, in terms of food shortages and stuff, this one near and dear to Bob and I's heart. The country ran out of beer. If I were a dictator, I'd make sure like toilet paper and beer are the two things I would not run out of. But they actually ran out of beer, or more specifically, their big brewing company, Polar, ran out of foreign exchange with which they could import the barley in order to make the beer. So there was a time where beer wasn't there. And note what's happened now with democratic socialism. Right now, there's an opposition leader in parliament who's been named the interim president. The United States recently recognized him. Meanwhile, Chavez's successor, Maduro, holds on to power there. The elections he ran last year were a complete sham. Nobody believes that they were honest. Venezuela, which started out as democratic socialism, has become mere socialism. No more democratic. This is not an accident. We'll come back to that later. So if that's the collapse, Cuba is what Bob and I might call the softer side of socialism. It's the warm Caribbean island, and it's kind of sustaining its people and stagnating. So let's take a look there at some of the lessons about how this system functions. So remember, government ownership of the means of production. One of the means of production would be the hotels. The hotels are government owned in Cuba. So Bob and I weren't trying to sandbag this. We had no desire to suffer and be in crappy places. So we had asked a friend for a recommendation, and they pointed out this 3-star hotel that you see sticking up in the middle there in the suburbs of Havana, right on the coast. Let me give you a different picture of it. That's what it looked like when it opened in 1979. I mean, it's got that kind of commie blockhouse look to it, except tipped vertical instead of sideways. But it's gleaming white and looks decent. If you zoom in, I don't know how well you can see that there now, but you can see the stains on the outside and the kind of nastiness of it. The elevator there, you can see the first 3 letters of SER. It's out of service. So this whole building that's that tall has one elevator for it. That's awesome. We walked up, 5, 8 flights of stairs with our bags, sweating as a result. This is the bathroom. It's missing a panel. We wasn't particular to this hotel because later on in the week we stayed at a different hotel, Hotel Carib, I think, and right on the main drag in central Havana, right next to the Cuban government. And Bob went in and checked out, and I told him, I'm like, if it's as crappy as that other one, I'm like, don't do it. And I was having a beer on the porch while he was doing that, and he comes back, he's like, no, it's okay. I got to think that he was just crazy because the air conditioning hit him, because this place was worse than the other one. That's the sanitary glass that came out of the bag. You can see it's not very sanitary. They were kind enough to leave the previous guest's soap at the sink for us to use. The towel had a hole in it. The toilet, can you see the bolt missing in it? If you sit on the seat, you got to be careful because you might slide off. This is a product of government ownership of the means of production here. Incentives matter. Private property and profits give you an incentive to try to attract customers and please customers. The people who run this hotel could give two shits if you ever come back to the hotel or not, because nobody makes any money by running that hotel efficiently. Instead, they've let it decay. Incentives matter. At the same time, in Cuba, they allow people to rent out their homes, casa particular, where you can rent from individual people, where they do give a shit because they make a little bit of money on it. Actually, you want to take a guess? Just yell it out. The 2 Cuban hotels that we stayed in, any guess per night what we paid? 200, no, way high. About $50 a night. About 50 and 160 in the other, I think. This is a casa particular in central Havana. There's 2 bedrooms, a little kitchen. There's a nice balcony. I don't know if I have a picture of that one on there too. No. In very good condition. This also cost about $50 a night, arranged via Airbnb overseas ahead of time, and then they called a neighbor to meet us and let us in and let us stay there in central Havana. We stayed in another one that was equally in good condition but smaller for $25 a night. These are people who have very meager income, but because they can make a little money renting out their house to tourists, reinvest the profits from that in maintaining it so other people will want to rent it. Both services are the same, sleeping places. In one case you have private ownership, good incentives. In the other case you have state ownership, no incentives, no one gives a shit. Bob, you want to show them some more stuff like this?
Yeah, so as economists, one of the things about Cuba that we learned really quickly was the prices don't make sense. Here in America, in a modern market economy, prices tell us things. A nice restaurant that's overlooking a colonial square on a balcony, that's going to be an expensive restaurant, right? And the little place down an alley off on the side, that's going to be the cheaper restaurant. Except in Cuba, the prices would be the same at the very nice place as the not so nice place, and the menus would all be the same. So prices didn't make any sense, and there was also none of the cues that you get from sort of market systems. Can you see any? If you were looking down that street, do you know what's down there? There's no advertising. There's no signs. It was almost impossible when you were looking down a street in Havana, especially outside of the tourist area in the old area. You would look down the street. It's like, I don't know if there's any restaurants. Is this residential or what? So it was very hard to get information about where to go and what to do, how to just feed yourself and so forth. And we're rich tourists.
And the key thing is, this isn't poverty, right? You've been in plenty of poor countries. They all have signs. Like the local beer company puts signs on stores.
Absolutely. So this is a typical, we saw hundreds of these. You go by, it's little tienda, little stores. And they seem at first well stocked. There's items on the shelves. But if you look closely, there's about a dozen distinct items in this store. So they have like a whole bunch of one item and a whole bunch of another item, but that's basically it. So one of the things we realized very quickly is that the entire supply chain, the entire system produces some things. It clearly has things for sale, but it produces an extraordinarily limited variety of those things.
Talk about the variety of beer.
Well, there's 2 beers. There's 2 beers, Cristal and Bucanero. One was dark and one was light. They tasted the same to me. But so 2 beers. If you were in a very rich hotel, you might be able to find somebody had smuggled something in, but 2 beers. So that was, and then, there were places, one kind of cornflakes. It looks like Kellogg's, but of course it's a knockoff. But then there were bear shells as well. And so as you went from place to place, and whether you were in a state-owned restaurant or a private one, this is a privately owned restaurant, and the private restaurants were really quite nice. They're owned by private entrepreneurs. They are now allow small-sized restaurants, and the wait staff was very good, very attentive, sort of first class. But the food was the same as any other restaurant, and the reason is because the supply of food is still coming from the state system. The products that are coming from farms and so forth is all coming from the state suppliers. And so even the private owners didn't have much more variety on their menus. The service was better in the private places than in the government-run restaurants. But the food was actually the same, and the prices were the same. So very quickly, we started doing weird things like, staying, like we normally avoid fancy places on balconies because that's too expensive. There's usually a trade-off between a quality meal and the view in the real world, like our world. In this world, it's like, well, it's the same quality no matter where we sit, so we might as well sit in a nice sort of balcony area looking over the town. The other thing about prices is there are some private markets, that are legal. And of course, cars are famous in Cuba. There's an American car, mid-50s car there in the background. And how much? So I actually kind of a car guy. Ben's a little bit of a car guy too. In America, that car, that red American car, it's a junk. The engine is no longer the Detroit engine. It's been retrofitted with some engine from God knows where. The suspension's the original suspension. There's no air conditioning. It's a disaster of a car. Trust us, when you first get to Cuba, you're like, oh, I get to drive in a 1956 Plymouth. And then you get in a 1956 Plymouth in Cuba and you realize, get me out of this car. It's horrible. That's about $2,000 on an American market. That's a barn find almost. You could pretty much roll your trailer up, grab that car, take it away from the barn for a couple $1,000. It's not worth much, even in the United States. Now, you fix it up, it's going to be worth, $50,000, but not in that condition. Now, right in front of it, though, this is the one that really got us crazy. That's a 1991 Renault. They had Renaults and Peugeots that came in, some French cars that came in early 90s. It's a 30-year-old Renault. How much do you think that would cost here in Denver? If you could even find one still on a lot in a Denver used car lot. It's not even a $500 car, is it? I mean, I think the joke in the book is the dealer would probably just give it to you if you just pay the tax and title, right? I mean, take it away. Just get it off my lot. How much do you think that car sells for in Cuba? $35,000 US dollars. The bad American car that would be worth a couple $1,000s here, that's $20,000. So what's happened is the Cuban government won't let it, and this is not the American policy this time, the Cuban government will not let cars be imported into the country. So the few cars that are there, the price of those just skyrockets, way beyond any normal price. So again, the price is every price you went to, whether it was a restaurant meal or the cars that you saw on the streets, all the prices just didn't make sense, and that's one of the hallmarks of a socialist system, is that prices usually don't make sense. One of our next trip was to Korea. Now, Ben and I are free market American economists and libertarians, and I've said things on tape like the North Korean government is evil and things. So we did not go to North Korea because our wives wouldn't let us. So we went to Dandong China, which is on the border of North Korea and China, on the northern North Korea border. And when we arrived, the Dandong is a very prosperous, modern Chinese city. Skyscrapers, lots of lights at night. When we arrived, the other side of the river, the Yalu River, it was dark over there. We weren't really sure what was on the North Korean side. That's what the North Korean side looked like. When we, I'm going to come back to that. This is a nighttime picture. You see these bridges? This is a bridge going across the river. So this is the Chinese side, all the lights. On the other side is the North Korean side. And when we woke up in the morning, we see actually there's a city of 800,000 people or something. 350,000 people, I exaggerate. 350,000 people on the other side of there, and just complete, absolute, utter darkness on the other side. So if you've ever seen that satellite photo of North Korea, that's not a Photoshop. I mean, it's literally true. Dandong is where we were, was that very bright spot right there in the north part of North Korea. So it's literally true, and this is why this chapter is called Dark Socialism. That's a picture on the other side. That's a picture of Ben looking at the Chinese side. It was among the starkest contrasts you'll ever see.
Yeah, I think that's the real point here. We've both seen plenty of places that are very poor before, have housing that looks like this, but it's not natural to see that and then just pivot your head. These pictures are taken right next to each other. That's maybe 100 yards off the North Korean border while we're in a boat. Turn our heads around, boom, that's what's on the other side. That's not natural. That's the product of different economic systems. Now, the real comparison is back here where Bob did it with South Korea and North Korea, but you can't see it along the border as easily because it's the demilitarized zone there, so you don't have the two systems right next to each other. China is not as capitalist as South Korea is. So the starkness of the comparison isn't quite as good, but you can actually see it there on the border where you can't on the south. And the real story here is this is like a rare natural example in the world where you kind of have something that looks like a controlled experiment of capitalism versus socialism. You have Korea at the end of World War II is all one country. It's people with the same language, the same history, the same geography. And at the end of World War II, the area that's now North Korea had about 80% of the country's industry, 90% of its electrical power, 75% of its mining, The South is a little bit better at farming because it's got a more hospitable climate for that. But by most measures, the North would be considered richer at the end of World War II. Then you get the Korean War that decimates the entire peninsula. By 1960, after the war, with foreign military aid from Russia and from the United States to the South, the GDP per capita, the average incomes, by most estimates, are about the same in North and South Korea. But the big difference is that North Korea embraced a socialist economic system. They collectivized agriculture, and they abolished private businesses by 1960. Subsequently, they stagnated. South Korea was a little rocky at the end of the war, but eventually by the 1970s, they end up having pretty good economic freedom and eventually democratic freedoms. In terms of Bob's index, they're in the top fifth, the top 20% of most free countries in the world, so very capitalist. Their incomes today are about $37,000 around the country. Life expectancy since 1960 increases from 53 years to 82 years. Infant mortality down 96%. South Korea, just like North Korea, was a pre-industrial society in 1960. They vaulted to first world wealthy status. Meanwhile, in the North, it's stagnated or retrogressed. Average incomes, which, by the way, whether in Cuba or North Korea, in a socialist country, measuring average incomes is guesswork because incomes and prices don't really mean the same thing. But ballpark, $1,700 per capita. They're poor. In the 1990s, when Russia collapsed in 1991 and aid collapsed in North Korea, about 3 million people starved to death because their economic system couldn't feed themselves. This is your side-by-side comparison of one peninsula, one people, one history, equal starting point, capitalism, socialism, great divergence. There's no more stark contrast in the world, and you can see it with your own eyes on the Chinese side of China's version of capitalism. Which brings us to the next country in here, fake socialism, China. China is not socialist. China has a communist political party that still runs it. But the reforms that have happened, so they don't have political freedom, but the reforms, the economic reforms that have happened over the last, 40 years basically, have transformed what was a socialist economic system run by a communist political party to a crony capitalist economic system run by a communist political party. I've got plenty of reservations about crony capitalism, and so does Bob. But when we compare it with socialism, crony capitalism is still a hell of a lot better than that benchmark. So what we see in China as you go around is capitalism's everywhere. Remember the lack of signs in South Korea? China, there's signs everywhere, and there's signs that you recognize, and there's rich signs for Rolex and for everything else, for McDonald's. Capitalism is everywhere in China. You can see this picture on the right is Pudong across the river from the old part of Shanghai in China. And the building that's happened there is tremendous, because this is that same view across the river when we were there a year and a half ago, juxtaposed with a 1990 picture. This isn't 1960 to present of change. This is 1990 to present. At Pudong, what happened was they declared that one of the free trade zones in China, where people got more economic freedoms than they had in the rest of the country, including more banking financial freedoms in this area than other free trade zones in the country. The boom was massive. It goes from being a slum across the river from Shanghai to having incomes over $22,000 per day average there. That's 1990 to now. Blink of an eye development that happened there with a little bit of economic freedom. So what happened in China? It was a socialist hell. During the Great Leap Forward time, it along with war communism in early Soviet history are probably the two times where real economic systems got as close to pure socialism as you can get. So if we think of capitalism and socialism on a spectrum, no socialist country has been purely 100% government ownership of the means of production. No capitalist country has 100% pure free markets and pure private ownership. There's a continuum there. But the closest bumping up of that socialist end of the continuum, China during the late 1950s, early 1960s is right there. During this time, approximately 45 million people die unnecessarily. And it's not just saying there was a famine. A famine does not do it justice. There was intentional famine, there was intentional neglect of people, there were executions. 45 million people. As one of Mao's officials said, casualties have indeed appeared among the workers, but it is not enough to stop us in our tracks. This is a price we have to pay. It's nothing to be afraid of. Now we have a few cases of illness and death. It is nothing. Similarly, they said things like, well, they've died in communist wars. They can die in the economic war. This is followed then by the Cultural Revolution, where another 500,000 to 2 million die. During this time, they had collectivized farms, abolished private businesses, abolished the private markets, even the informal little black markets. This was you had a commune where you got your food from. Then, after Mao's death, eventually in 1968, Deng Xiaoping comes to power, and he starts the process of reform. Decollectivizes agriculture, so starts allowing for, at first, surpluses on the collective farms to be sold by the people who are running the farms, and then eventually greater and greater degrees of privatization of farming. Private enterprises at small scale started to become legal. You have millions of people who were pushed into the rural countryside for cultural re-education during the Cultural Revolution, coming back to cities and needing jobs. Firms that aren't legal popping up to employ them, but the state ignoring it because they needed somebody to employ the young men coming back to the cities. Then you start with these enterprise zones as well in the 1980s, more and more of them popping up where they have greater economic freedoms than the rest of the country. Yet mass migration internally in China, people moving from rural areas to cities, and mostly to cities that are more capitalist and more economically free. Literally hundreds of millions of people moving, and the income differences between rural China and cities in China are big or bigger than income differences we see between Latin American countries and the United States that have caravans trying to migrate here. Except that's all happening internal in China with very little restriction on it. It's literally hundreds of millions of people escaping extreme poverty by moving to the more capitalist cities, roughly 750 million. Now, this is still a communist police state. It's crony capitalist, and that's more productive. But Bob and I experienced it firsthand. We showed up at the Unirule Institute there to give a couple talks along with some other intellectuals, and we were talking about Ayn Rand and Ludwig von Mises and free market ideas with Chinese professors, and I thought that was pretty cool because we were right near communist headquarters in central Beijing. And that was all well and good, but the next morning we got an email from a friend saying, "My God, I hope you're not still at the Unirule Institute conference. The government thugs have shown up and chained the buildings closed. Then they've arrested the founder of the institute, put him under house arrest, actually. They shut it down because they didn't like the intellectual discussion that was going on there. So while they still have economic freedoms, there's plenty of free speech issues, civil freedoms, political freedoms that are missing there. And they still have a long ways to go on capitalism. But from where they started from, it's been a major shift towards capitalism, so much so that you can't call this a socialist country anymore. Speaking of other former socialist countries, Bob?
Okay, so we had to go to Russia, of course. We drank more vodka there than beer, but this chapter I think was probably the weakest chapter. We had great hopes for it, but it was hard to get Russians to talk about Soviet times. Soviet times are just a dark period, and people just really don't want to talk much. But we did stand in line at Lenin's tomb to see Lenin with all the other tourists. Most of these tourists were Russians just visiting Moscow. And you know, we hate lines because you know what, lines are something that happens when you've got a price wrong. You know, when the price is too low, people stand in line because we want to get that good price. And so the price of Lenin's tomb, like prices in the old Soviet Union, were too low. And so we thought it was appropriate, though, that there was a line for Lenin's tomb. I mean, if you want to remember Soviet socialism, a line is probably the most memorable aspect of the whole system, because the Soviets spent large amounts of their time in line. So we went from Russia, though, to another part of the old Soviet Union, Georgia. And the title of this chapter is not something socialism, it's just capitalism. And I've been to Georgia many times, I think 15, I've lost count. And Georgia was part of the Soviet Union. It's a country, a constituent part of the Soviet system. After 91, in 91, they declared independence, became an independent state. They kind of had a few civil wars for about a decade. But in 2004, they began liberalizing their economy. And I've been visiting Georgia ever since 2004, so I've been able to see Georgia's movements towards capitalism. This was the Stalin Museum. Stalin was from Georgia. In his hometown in Gori, there's a museum, and I couldn't resist the temptation to let the statue know what I thought about him.
I got in trouble for doing that when we were in Lenin's tomb.
Yeah, he actually flipped off Lenin at Lenin's tomb, and the guard did not appreciate the sentiment either. He got shushed, I guess is the word. So just a few words about Georgia. So Georgia is probably no other country in the world has transformed its economy from as far hard socialism, part of the Soviet Union, to what Georgia represents today. In the Economic Freedom Index that we've mentioned a few times, Georgia is currently ranked 6th out of 162. 6th. So it's Hong Kong, Singapore, I think New Zealand, Australia, and then Georgia. 27 years ago, it was a Soviet republic, and today it gets an economic freedom score that's more or less on par with that of the United States. And the reforms in Georgia are really too numerous to list, but they have a 12% flat tax. They've eliminated 30 different types of taxes. They fired 90%, literally 90% of government employees were fired. In one day, they fired 30,000+ police officers. They were all corrupt police officers. They would set up roadblocks on the roads, and they would stop your car, and they would shake you down for a bribe. And one day, the new government came in 2005, and they just fired 30,000 cops. The joke was they got rid of the cops, and crime went down because they were the criminals. So it says 8th in economic freedom. That's from the old version. 6th in the most recent version. Today, incomes have been growing in Georgia. It's actually better than 2,500, the most recent numbers I just looked at. Incomes have gone up in Georgia from about $4,000 per person, which is very poor, to now about $8,000. So in about a decade, they've doubled their income. And that's Chinese-like almost growth rates. So if you can double a couple times, 2 or 3 times, double, and double again, you'll end up being a pretty prosperous place. And Georgia's done very well. That's a picture of a police station in a sign of the New Times. All the police stations are glass because that signals transparency. Like literally, they mean transparency. So that's why they make everything out of glass now. Our last stop was to go back to the United States, because at the recommendation of an economist friend of ours, he says, well, you've traveled to all these socialist or former socialist countries. We have socialists in the United States. Maybe you should go talk to them. So we went and talked to some socialists in the United States.
Yeah. So we went back in the USSA. The idea was we weren't going to go argue with a bunch of socialists. We can argue with people all the time. We wanted to understand what the hell people are thinking. So the project starts with us wondering, why are people attracted to socialism in the United States today? We tour around the world. We see that socialism sucks, and it sucks, by the way, from the perspective of basically rich outsiders who have money when we're visiting these places, and it's still unpleasant and crappy, let alone if you actually live in it and have those incomes and the limited choices there. I mean, Cuban food being bland in Cuba for a week is boring and sucks for us. Try living with it for your life. That we could escape that. We think, what are young socialists in the United States thinking that they would say, we want socialism? So we showed up here to ask them, why are you attracted to socialism? What is socialism? How would you like it to operate? The discussions we had were enlightening. A large number, maybe somewhere between a third and half of the people that we talked to, didn't identify socialism with abolishing private property and having some version of collective ownership of the means of production. That's the essential feature of socialism. The defining characteristic is abolishing the private property and the means of production. A third to half the people at the conference, and this is the largest socialist gathering in the United States, didn't identify it with that. They just had some version of hard left politics, left of the Democratic Party, and they wanted to call it socialism. Well, it's not socialism, and I think there's lots of problems with some of the policies that they favored, but they wouldn't end up turning you into a socialist hell. Some of them just liked, well, you ask them what country, they like Sweden, except Sweden's not socialist. It's got a lot of labor market regs and high government spending and taxes. Those have their problems. Sweden basically stagnated relative to what was happening in other wealthy European countries from the 1970s to present. It's a slowdown, but that's not an impoverishment. It's still relatively rich. A number of them do actually mean abolish private property in the means of production and have some version of collective ownership. But what we found there is, and we attended many of the conference sessions, we learned how state capitalism is failing in Venezuela and state capitalism is being practiced in North Korea, and that the International Socialist Organization representatives there don't condone Soviet Russia, Maoist China, or these other regimes. These were state capitalist regimes because they weren't our style of socialism. So I'd ask more, or Bob would too. What is your style of socialism? And what we'd hear is things like democratic socialism and socialism from below. But what does socialism from below mean? Well, we don't want an authoritarian dictatorship running the country. We want, like, the workers to decide for themselves what to produce and how to produce it. And we'll just do this collectively, which is all fine and good until the guys at the tire plant collectively decide to make 18-inch tires, and the guys at the trucking plant decide to make trucks that require 35-inch tires. If the workers themselves from below just get to make up what they do, they have to find a way to coordinate with the other producers. Otherwise, you have economic chaos, autarky. In a capitalist system, it's prices and property rights that do this. The tire company has property rights and profits if it makes the size tire that somebody wants to buy. We use price signals to send information about what resources are desired where. And then because we have profits that people keep for themselves, they're incentivized to do it. If we're abolishing private property and the means of production, we need some other reconciliation mechanism to coordinate our economy. Collective ownership from below still needs to coordinate unless you're going to be a subsistence standard of living isolated from the international or even the national division of labor. Unless you're going to produce everything for yourselves within your commune. And by the way, Bob and I know there's voluntary communes in the world. We have no beef with that. If people want to live in a voluntary commune together, I'm cool with that. You, Bob?
Yeah, but if you've studied voluntary communes, most of them fail because of the problems you've just identified.
Yeah, and of course, most of them also depend on trade with the outside world of capitalist goods because they can't make their own cell phone in a commune or any number of other things. But this means then, once you abolish private property, you need a system to coordinate. How do you do that? Well, you need a plan. What do you need for a plan? You need centralized authority to tell people where to work. By the way, those means of production that are collectively owned, workers are a means of production. You no longer own your own labor. You are part of the economic plan. This is no accident. Democratic socialism of collective ownership of the means of production is impossible. It's impossible because you can't have meaningful political freedom. Once you need to centralize economic control of your system, how do you oppose the regime and democratically change it when the regime itself controls your livelihood in every way? Meaningful opposition becomes impossible under such a situation. And meanwhile, economic stagnation, which is going to be the result of not having the right information or the right incentives with collective ownership in order to get high levels of production and growth, that stagnation and failure is going to be met with the leaders having to either roll back and give greater private property economic freedoms or exert more and more authority. That's how you end up with authoritarian regimes in all of the cases where people have tried collective ownership on a large scale. And that's what seems to be lost among the young socialists that we talked to there who really meant abolishing private property, is how to have a planning system, how to have a coordination system while maintaining the democratic freedoms, which I believe that they honestly mean that they want to preserve. So I'll end with just a little bit of irony and product variety here then. As you'll see on the right, that's the beer taps at the hotel at the Socialism Conference in Chicago that we attended. You can see a green tap with a red star on it, Revolution Ale. It's the largest independently owned private brewery in Illinois, and they make all sorts of beers with commie names and imagery on them. But the irony, of course, is that they have more than 20 different types of beer that range from very low alcohol to barley wine, high alcohol. They have lots of variety. In fact, that one brewery has more variety in their beer than all of the socialist governments around the planet combined. And happily for us, our book is available now for pre-sale on Amazon. It made #1 in the category of beer. So I encourage you to help us stay there by using the little postcards that you have and ordering some copies as well. So Bob, with that, shall we wrap up and take any questions that you all have?
There's a microphone down here. They're
Alex,
streaming
the
this
mic is next to you, buddy.
online, so we need to have that again.
There's one up in the front here.
So I noticed during your lecture you talked a little bit about healthcare in Sweden and in those other European countries where it's like heavily subsidized / government supported. And I was wondering, in your opinion, is there any chance it could be possible to maintain our current values that we've been so successful with and provide some kind of universal health care?
I'll be happy to take this. Is a good question. I don't think universal almost anything is really a hard thing. We live in a world of scarcity, so it's hard to make everything available to everybody as much as we'd like. And every economic system, whether it's a socialist system or a capitalist system, has to ration scarce resources. So to me, the question is, what's the optimal mix? And I'm going to be the last person to defend the sort of system we have in the United States. But the reality is about 50% of healthcare spending in the United States is government-financed healthcare spending. So you could argue that we've already sort of 50% socialized our system, and we're quite unsatisfied with what we have. If you go to Europe, you mentioned Sweden. If you go to Europe, what you'll find is although there is universal health, that doesn't necessarily mean universally funded and financed by government. It may mean that, as it does like in Canada, but it doesn't necessarily mean that. You'll find ratios of private spending and private healthcare provision in European countries that are 20-30%. So it's 50% here, it's 20% in Sweden. Let's say I made that number up. I'm not sure exactly the number. So what really is, it's really more of a degree. It's a lot like the tax conversation. The United States has taxes that are about 30% of gross domestic product. In Sweden, it's about 45% of gross domestic product. Their taxes are about 50% higher than ours. So we're really not talking about difference of kind. We're talking about differences of degree. And we could debate that. I don't have a strong view, but I think it's not correct to say the U.S. is a free market healthcare system. It's also not correct to say countries in Europe have completely socialized systems. It's much more of a continuum, and we're not as far from them in reality as it appears, and maybe we'll talk about.
Hi, my name is Jenny. Thank you for being here today. I have two questions that kind of tie in together. One, what are the biggest cons you think exist with capitalism? And then two, do you think it's the government's responsibility to provide free healthcare and free education, or do you think there's something wrong with that?
So I think the biggest problem with capitalism is that we don't have it. That what we have in the United States and in all other countries of the world is some version of crony capitalism. And the crony part is government power that gives special favors to private companies to profit. So it's still profit, but I wouldn't call that capitalism as in free markets and voluntary exchange. I would call it a coerced system via the government. And it is the fact that people who have more money have more power under such a system, but that power isn't their economic power from saying, would you like to buy this? When you can say no. Their economic power is them using their money to buy influence in government, who will limit your range of choices to the things that they want to sell. I think the problem then isn't freedom in free markets. The problem is government stepping in and interfering with markets so that what we experience isn't real freedom of exchange in markets and the cronyisms that's there. I think that's what to oppose. What was the second part of the question?
I was asking, do you think it's the government's responsibility to provide free healthcare and education, or do you think there's something wrong with that?
Yeah, I think, listen, we have scarcity. So if we're going to provide zero monetary cost education and healthcare, those resources have to come from somewhere, and that's going to slow down the economy and other people's wealth creation in other sectors. Not to mention, it's still going to create perverse incentives. Once it's universally provided and you do not depend on people's money purchases for it, you're going to distort incentives and information within the industry, and I think you're going to get worse healthcare and worse education as a result. I think getting rid of monopoly power of the AMA, getting monopoly power of the FDA, who makes drugs ridiculously expensive by limiting competition there, things that would free up markets in education and healthcare, I think would be a big improvement.
If I may just chime in, one of the things that really worries economists about making anything freely available is if you've ever been to an open bar at a wedding, and we know what happens at open bars at weddings, people overdrink, they and the bill goes up, so we have a huge bill, but also people get drunk, and we make decisions that we really wouldn't make if there was some price associated with our actions. And that's a challenge with all of these types of questions.
There's a line of people over there for the microphone. Please
go ahead and get in line.
Hi, thanks for being here today. Justin, economics major. So I know as economists, we're big proponents of capitalism, and I've kind of wanted to hear what your opinion is on socially responsible companies to see if sort of maybe any elements of socialism or social responsibility could be integrated into a capitalist free market economy.
You know, I use the term economic freedom a lot more than I use the term capitalism, and I think the word freedom is really the key word. You know, you're free to run your business however you want, and if you want to put a picture of Scrooge McDuck and you know, a greedy capitalist pig, and make that your sort of corporate image, and if that works for you, fine. If, on the other hand, you know, one of our friends, John Mackey, founder of Whole Foods, you know, he set up his company with a very different and consciously, he calls it conscious capitalism. He set his company up very consciously different, and that's fine. It's freedom. I mean, and I don't actually, as an economist, I don't think I could sit in this chair and sort of prescribe what the right way to run any company is. That's the whole point of the system, is to let people discover that in markets. But I'm in favor of those people. I think great.
Yeah, and in fact, when John Mackey was talking at your shop one time, I was there, and he had described, you know, stakeholders in Whole Foods, which includes the community, customers, employees. And he also described how Whole Foods grew with this kind of corporate social responsibility type image, and how this was different than just profit maximizing in the marketplace. And I raised my hand and asked him, I said, sounds to me like what you're doing is just profit maximization rightly understood with certain imaging. And I'm like, what do you say to that? He says, bad marketing. The point is, within a capitalist or free market system, there's plenty of room for things like that. As an individual company thing, what we have to be careful of is that we don't make it a law or regulation that every business has to pursue a certain line like that.
Hello, my name is Enrique. I'm also an econ major. I understand that there's been a loss of confidence and, you know, stuff from certain people on capitalism, the way how we do economic analysis, or just, you know, the way how we operate businesses. So how much do you think stuff like stakeholder theory or behavioral economics could, you know, give us that, retain that confidence, or tell people that, you know, we're upgrading, we're doing our best to, you know, to, I guess, grant validity to an economic structure like capitalism?
I can start with that. You know, I'm not a huge fan of stakeholder theory, I have to admit. You know, we have a system for exercising influence in a market economy, and that is by buying products. When you buy a product, you're influencing the provider of that product to provide more of it. If you sell a product, stakeholders. We have shareholders. You know, these are people that actually buy shares of stock in a company, and that's a pretty effective way to influence a company. It's not, you know, 100% effective. Nothing is. But to me, the shareholder concept is sort of outsiders who have no stake in the game. Actually, frequently they say they do, but they just sort of want to impose their will. And I'm uncomfortable with that. I mean, we have ways in markets of exercising influence with the people that we are doing dealings with, and the stakeholder literature that I've read seems to want to sort of forcibly impose an outsider's view. And maybe I'm misreading it, but that's what I think.
And to the other part of that question, what I'd say is I think we have to do a better job of explaining that a free market economy that is a profit and loss system, and we need both the profits and the losses to be borne by those making the decisions. So relating it back to like the financial crisis that you mentioned of 2008 with people losing confidence, a lot of that wasn't the loss of confidence of capitalism. It was the cronyism of bailing out cronies who didn't suffer the losses. And this sets up bad incentives for the next time around. And I think economists have to do a better job explaining of the interventionism that led to that crisis and the perpetuation of it.
Well, you guys went on a real whirlwind trip around the world there. I really wish the Koch brothers could pay for me to go around the world to go check out these other places around the world and what have you, and then come out here and select facts from that. It was really interesting. You guys went to Venezuela and took pictures there of folks who weren't starving. You couldn't find anyone who was starving over there, despite you saying people are losing weight. You think you just see people walking around with their skeletons. You didn't show pictures of that. In fact, you kind of screwed up and showed a picture of a stack of bags of rice in the one there. Good job there.
That was in Colombia, but thank you.
Oh, so it wasn't in Venezuela even, but so you're trying to pass off Colombia as Venezuela. Gotcha, cool. All right. The other thing, why is it, my actual question here is, why is it that in a lot of these former socialist countries and so on and so forth, so many people want a return to the old, like, say, Soviet system? A lot of people from the Soviet states, over 50%, want to return. And I'm not talking about the youth. I'm talking about the people who lived through that. Want to return to the old system. The Chinese right now are jailing students that want a return before the Dengist reforms. What response do you have to that?
Sure. Older people who were privileged under the old system, who aren't competing in the new environment, it's no surprise that they'd have nostalgia for a system where they were subsidized by others. The reality is that that system stagnated and could not provide a higher standard of living, and that's why overwhelmingly young people have no interest in returning to it in those systems. For the record, I would love it if Charles Koch would pay me to go around the world too, but he didn't. The pictures in Venezuela, the reason those people aren't starving is, I think we mentioned this, these were the middle class and upper middle class Venezuelans that still had cash and could make it to the border in Colombia where there was that food available to them. So they're resorting to a six-day grocery run to another country to get those basic staples because it's not being supplied there in Venezuela.
Thank you guys for coming. My name's Wilder. I have a different question. What do you think the role is? What do you think the proper role is for a government then, if it is not providing the social welfare of the economy? And what are your views on anarcho-capitalism?
Well, after a couple beers, I turn into an anarcho-capitalist. But since I have yet to have a beer today yet, and Ben may have a slightly different point of view. I just don't find discussions about anarcho-capitalism very interesting for the same reason I don't find discussions about utopian communism very interesting, because I haven't really observed many of these places in the world. I'm an empiricist, and what I have observed is imperfect systems that we call capitalist systems. They're imperfect. They're not the kind of capitalist system that I would like or an anarcho-capitalist would like. But they seem to work pretty well. And if you compare them with the imperfect systems of socialism, it's not even a close call. So to me, the conversations over beer about anarcho-capitalism and communism are great fun. But as an economist, I don't think that's very interesting. I want to talk about the real world, where we have real experience with different types of economic systems and comparing those systems one to another. To me, that's where valuable social science is done. And on that, I think, socialism kind of sucks. But again, go catch up with us at the bar later, and we'll talk about anarcho-capitalism. I love those conversations, but they're so devoid of empirical content that I don't find them very interesting. Ben probably disagrees. I'm not sure.
No, I think for the purposes certainly of the research on this book, I mean, there's a young woman at the Washington Post, and she wrote, I think of socialism as being on a spectrum. And this book is all about the spectrum of something that, if you want to call anarcho-capitalism, of no government at all, as being pure capitalist, that's one far end of the pole, and then complete and utter all collective ownership of the means of production, the other pole. That's fine. We have no real world examples of either of those right now. But then the ones that are closer to this is what we're talking about in this book of they're not functioning very well. Whereas when we see the ones that are more capitalist, they're functioning pretty well. And I'll be happy to chat about the other stuff in the bar too.
Thank you.
Hello. So one of the things I've noticed a lot with with socialism as being something that people have been putting forth as a valid idea in the United States, one thing I've noticed is that the people that tend to further it tend to be young. They tend to be people who are educated, people who are college graduates, and in a lot of cases, people who aren't finding a lot of economic opportunity where they thought they would find it. You know, for example, people who go through high school, go through college, and then they don't find that opportunity, and then they blame the system that they grew up in and saying that it's unfair. Part of my question is, in your travels, did you find that did you talk to any of them about their education and how that made their opportunities more or less limited in these different countries? And the other part of that would be, do you think the current education system we have, could that in some way be fixed by pushing it towards something that's less centralized? And that would create a better variety of opportunity for people living here.
So I'm sympathetic to the idea that, I mean, certainly a lot of people go to college and get majors that don't match up to labor market skills and labor market opportunities, and then they resent the system that doesn't pay them the wage that they delusionally think that they should get. And that might make one more favorable to saying that we should have some alternative system where artists are valued more than economists or what have you. But of course, you also get perversities then, like in Cuba, where if you pay your musicians like you pay your plumbers, everybody's got clogged pipes. Because we need a market system to incentivize some forms of work over others. I think you're onto something there. I'm not sure about educational mismatch. You know, actually the one that's most obvious to us in our travels in former Soviet countries of educational mismatch is the high number of physicists in the former Soviet Republic. Because if you're smart and you wanted to be intellectually honest, you could do physics. But if you did anything in humanities or social science, you couldn't be intellectually honest. You had to support the regime. So you get an oversupply of mathematicians and physicists and such like that.
Very interesting. Thanks.
Hi. So if we look out throughout the West and the EU and America, you're seeing a lot of economic anger with things like the Elvis protests in France, and here in America with candidates like AOC, Bernie, and even Trump. Don't you think that this is largely indicative of some sort of failure of this neoliberal economic system?
Well, I mean, so the interesting thing about the latest unrests is that it's both left wing and right wing and progressive and sort of retrogressive or whatever. And I think what you're onto is that there is in fact a deep-seated belief on the part of many people that the government, this God called government, is going to fix all the things in the world. And you know, the word scarcity keeps coming up. You know, I'm an economist. We live in a world of scarcity. We're never going to live in a world where all of our wants and needs are going to be fully realized and satisfied. That's not going to happen under capitalist systems. It's not going to. The best version of capitalism, the best version of socialism, is just not going to happen. But people kind of want that, and so you go through these periods of time where those desires bubble up, and sometimes they bubble up on a sort of a left-wing version, and sometimes they bubble with a more of a right-wing version. And sometimes you can't even really tell if it's the left-right thing kind of breaks down. But I think that's natural. That's the way people are, and I don't see it as an indictment, though, really, of the current system. And we could be all living in the lap of luxury in some futuristic sci-fi world, and there would still be people complaining about some imperfection in the system. So I think that's going to be a natural facet of any political economy.
Yeah, and I'd say actually what was enlightening too at the Socialism 2018 conference, and listening to the themes on the panels and the things that people complained about as injustices, Bob and I actually found ourselves largely sympathetic to a lot of what they were arguing when they're saying that criminal justice is unjust in the United States, when they're saying that they're against imperialism and foreign intervention by our government in the United States, when they're saying that we need to be more pro-immigration in the United States. We find ourselves like sympathetic that the current system is unjust and not doing good things, but the answer isn't socialism. So if you're a capitalist, you should be anti-war for capitalist reasons. Capitalism is about freedom of exchange, not violence overseas. And if you're a capitalist, you should be for free trade, And that's free trade in goods and services, but free trade in labor too. We should be letting immigrants move into the country more. So we found ourselves agreeing with a lot of injustices that they would point out, but then having radically different means of trying to address them rather than saying socialism is the answer.
All right, thank you.
Hi. Okay, so I have kind of a twofold. The first is that, do you believe that capitalism requires regulation? Particularly when it comes to things as for-profit entities that are providing life-saving necessities.
Sure. We require governance and regulation. This doesn't necessarily mean it has to be supplied by the government. Last night I did an event at UC Denver here on sweatshops and something called the Accord in Bangladesh. And the Accord is a group that companies sign up with where they say that they're going to certify that all of their suppliers have certain minimum safety standards at their factories. And the people sign a legally binding agreement, then it's an outside monitor and third-party seal of approval on that. That's a form of, I don't know if I'd call it capitalist, but voluntary-based governance and regulation. And I think we shortchange things when we say either the government has to regulate or it's unregulated. I think there's lots of ways that markets find ways to do regulation, and that often it's a better way that's less subject to capture.
Okay, so you think that there's other ways other than government capping, like profits for life-saving things, for instance. There's other ways to control it. Because I mean, once a company reaches 200% profit, and they're still and it keeps raising year after year after year, and meanwhile people are unable to get what they need because of it. How do we regulate that? How do we put a cap on that excessive profit that need to be bigger and better every quarter and making better profits every quarter? How do we control that?
This is an excellent question. One of the most effective constraints on the ability to earn profit is a competitor. And one of the things that is unfortunate, especially in the healthcare environment, is the utter lack of competition that goes on. Especially with in drugs, with drug monopolies that are government enforced. Actually, I mean, the FDA essentially does
they're
this.
Bought and sold. They're bought and paid for.
So I mean, I think that one of the things we really ought to talk more about is how competition acts as a regulating force to prevent any one company from becoming too powerful. In a more competitive environment, I know Ben and I very much favor competitive markets. The other thing is I want to throw a bone to tort lawyers. I know. People like on the right like to complain about tort lawyers, but I love tort lawyers. If a company does harm to a customer, to a worker, or to anybody, the tort lawyers who come in and sue these companies for damages, I think they do. That's a very effective form of regulation in the system that deters those people from doing that.
But a lot of those people can't afford to get a lawyer. But
my point is that's part of the system, though, and it's not a perfect system, But I think there's elements out there that we ought to work harder on. I agree with you.
Do you believe that there should be, where it was before, where we had monopolies were not allowed, like companies weren't allowed to keep buying each other and become bigger and bigger and bigger? I know that was a law once that there was not monopolies that they were not to be allowed. I don't know what the law was exactly, but
the big thing that we want is freedom of entry. If people are free to enter, because what are profits? Profits are saying that you could transform resources, provide some good or service to somebody, and make a killing doing it. That's a big green light to competitors that says, come in and try to do this too. And when you do, you undercut their profits and drive it down. But in the process of delivering the valuable social services more to people. So I think the whole key here, whether life-saving or mundane, is freedom of entry so that the system can self-regulate. And then the life-saving related stuff in medicine, as Bob's mentioned, we just don't have great freedom of entry in that market, and that's why it's not a very good functioning market. Thank you.
When one company
we got
has
two
the
more.
corner.
We got two more people in line.
Yeah, and we're running out of time.
And we're 5 minutes over time right now.
So first of all, I want to sort of agree with you. Socialism does suck at the end of the day. I think what most people see is not necessarily that they would like to live in a socialist state. It's more people's dissatisfaction with the current way of things that's being sort of reflected in that. I think there's three main things that people are sort of dissatisfied by, which they sort of see socialism as the sort of solution to. Those three things to me are that sort of and you discussed this a little bit about how this capitalism has now turned oligarchical in some ways, where you have to have money and corporate power to have any sort of influence, and the decision makers all sort of center around the money. That's one thing. The other thing is a total lack of corporate social responsibility and accountability too. I think a lot of times people see some of these bigger corporations' behavior and think that they should and could be doing better. And then, of course, just like the overall commoditization of certain things that they think should not be commoditized, like health, like education, like public lands, where they're being told, and they're living in an economy in which in our case, it's a little better. We're paying 50, 60 grand for an education. A lot of people are paying, 100 plus grand. If you're going to grad school, you're probably looking at 300 grand overall the course of your education. So those three things, that oligarchical thing, the corporate social responsibility, and the commoditization. So those three things, I think, are really what people are looking at when they talk about wanting to move towards a socialist. And it's really not, I don't think people actually want a socialistic framework. They're more looking at, countries like Sweden, which you said is not socialist, and sort of looking at ways in which they could improve those things. So what's an alternative way, if you don't believe going in that direction on the spectrum towards Sweden, is to solve those three problems?
I would love it if Venezuela went towards Sweden.
Yeah.
And if China went towards Sweden, I think it would be great. So I think there's quite a lot I would disagree, but I think you're right. I don't think the Soviet peasant, the Russian peasants, and the urban poor in Moscow who welcomed the Bolsheviks, I don't think they wanted to live under 75-year police state either. But that's what they got. And that's what socialism brings. So I think one of the reasons we wanted to do this book was to sort of sound a warning bell to people, good people who have legitimate questions and legitimate complaints about the current system. And they're reaching towards this system, which has universally resulted in all of the opposite things that people claim to want. So and maybe it's that capitalists need to do a better marketing job, and that's our other job, is to talk about that. But Ben, I don't know if you had something else there.
No, I'd like the last person to be able to get their question in too.
So thank you for coming. I too have traveled the world and seen these socialistic atrocities played out in places and all over the world. Some of the places you guys have been. In Hungary, I went there. That was a really good one. And they had a whole museum about it and everything else and all the atrocities. And just talking to the people where it actually has been at would obviously not agree that it was a good idea, that they would ever want to go back to something like that. But I didn't get in line to ask a question, but rather to apologize on behalf of the pink-haired person, because I didn't want you to think that level of arrogance is an MSU thing, and also that it is only because we aren't purely socialistic that some can have that opinion and not be oppressed and or silenced like the countries that have been in that situation. So thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all.